God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. In 1650, the Council of the Propagation of the Faith was established at Turin. The chief counselors of state, the great lords of the country, and the dignitaries of the church enrolled themselves as a presiding board. Societies of women were formed, at the head of which was the Marchioness of Pianeza. She was the first lady at court, and as she had not worn the white rose of a blameless life, she was all the more zealous in this cause, in the hope of making expiation for the errors of the past. She was at infinite pains to further the object of the society, and her own eager spirit she infused into all under her. The lady propagandist, says Ledger, distributed the towns into districts, and each visited the district assigned to her twice a week, suborning simple girls, servant maids, and young children by their flattering allurements and fair promises, and doing evil turns to such as would not listen to them. They had their spies everywhere, who, among other information, ascertained in what Protestant families disagreements existed, and hither would the propagandists repair, stirring up the flame of dissension in order to separate the husband from the wife from the husband, the children from the parents, promising them, and indeed giving them, great advantages if they would consent to attend Mass. Did they hear of a tradesman whose business was falling off, or of a gentleman who from gambling or otherwise was in want of money, these ladies were at hand with their dabu tibi, I will give thee, on condition of apostasy, and the prisoner was in like manner relieved from his dungeon, who would give himself up to them, to meet the very heavy expenses of this proselytizing, to keep the machinery at work, to purchase the souls that sold themselves for bread. Regular collections were made in the chapels, and in private families, in the shops, in the inns, in the gambling houses, in the streets. Everywhere was alms-begging in operation. The Marchioness of Pianeza herself, great lady as she was, used every second or third day to make a circuit in search of subscriptions, even going into the taverns for that purpose. If any person of condition, who was believed to be able to contribute a coin, chanced to arrive at any hotel in town, these ladies did not fail to wait upon them, purse in hand, and solicit a donation. When persons of substance known to belong to the Reformed religion arrived in Turin, they did not scruple to ask money of them for the propagation of the faith, and the influence of the Marchioness, or fear of losing their errand and ruining their affairs, would often induce such to comply. While busied in the prosecution of these schemes, the Marchioness di Pianeza was deathly stricken. Feeling remorse, and wishing to make atonement, she summoned her lord, from whom she had been parted many years, to her bedside, and charged him, as he valued the repose of her soul and the safety of his own, to continue the good work on which her heart was set, of converting the Vaudois. To stimulate his zeal, she bequeathed him a sum of money, which, however, he could not touch till he had fulfilled the condition on which it was granted. The Marquis undertook the task with the utmost goodwill. A bigot and a soldier, he could think of only one way of converting the Vaudois. It was now that the storm burst. On the 25th of January, 1655, came the famous order of Gastaldo. The decree commanded all the Vaudois families domiciled in the communities of Lucerna, Finale, Bubania, Bricaracio, San Giovanni, and La Torre, in short, the whole of that rich district that separates their capital from the plain of Piedmont, to quit their dwellings within 3 days and retire into the valley of Bobbio and Grogna and Bora. This they were to do on pain of death. They were farther required to sell their lands to Romanus within 20 days. Those who were willing to abjure the Protestant faith were exempted from the decree. Anything more inhumane and barbarous in the circumstance than this edict it would not be easy to imagine. It was the depth of winter, and an alpine winter has terrors unknown to winters of even more northern regions. However, could a population like that on which the decree fell, including young children and old men, the sick and the bedridden, the blind and the lame, undertake a journey across swollen rivers, through valleys buried in snow, and over mountains covered with ice? They must inevitably perish, and the edict that cast them out was but another form of condemning them to die of cold and hunger. "Pray ye," said Christ, when warning his disciples to flee when they should see the Roman armies gathering around Jerusalem, "pray that your flight be not in the winter." The Romish propaganda at Turin chose this season for the enforced flight of the Vaudois. Cold were the icy peaks that looked down on the miserable troop, who were now fording the torrents and now struggling up the mountain tracks. But the heart of the persecutor was colder still. True, an alternative was offered them, that they might go to Mass. Did they avail themselves of it? The historian informs us that he had a congregation of well nigh 2,000 persons, and that not a man of them accepted the alternative. "I can well bear them this testimony," he observes, "seeing I was their pastor for 11 years. I knew every one of them by name. Judge, reader, whether I had not cause to weep for joy, as well as for sorrow, when I saw that all the fury of those wolves was not able to influence one of these lambs, and that no earthly advantage could shake their constancy. And when I marked the traces of their blood on the snow and ice over which they had dragged their lacerated limbs, had I not cause to bless God that I had seen accomplished in their poor bodies what remained of the measure of the sufferings of Christ, and especially when I beheld this heavy cross borne by them with a fortitude so noble." The Vaudois of the other valleys welcomed these poor exiles, and joyfully shared with them their own humble and scanty fare. They spread the table for all, and loaded it with polenta and roasted chestnuts, with the milk and butter of their mountains, to which they did not forget to add a cup of that red wine which their valleys produce. Their enemies were amazed when they saw the whole community rise up as one man and depart. Greater woes trod fast upon the heels of this initial calamity. A part only of the Vaudois nation had suffered from the cruel decree of Gastaldo, but the fixed object of the propaganda was the extirpation of the entire race, and the matter was gone about with consummate perfidy and deliberate cruelty. From the upper valleys, to which they had retired, the Waldenses sent respectful representations to the court of Turin. They described their piteous condition in terms so moving, and it would have been hard to have exaggerated it, and besought the fulfillment of treaties in which the honor and truth of the House of Savoy were pledged in language so temperate and just that one would have thought that their supplication must needs prevail. Alas, no! The ear of their prince had been poisoned by falsehood. Even access to him was denied them. As regarded the propaganda, their remonstrance, though accompanied with tears and groans, were wholly unheeded. The Vaudois were but charming deaf adders. They were put off with equivocal answers and delusive promises till the fatal 17th of April had arrived, when it was no longer necessary to dissemble and equivocate. On the day named above, April 17th, 1655, the Marquis de Pianeza departed secretly at midnight from Turin and appeared before the valleys at the head of an army of 15,000 men. The Waldensian deputies were by appointment knocking at the door of the Marquis in Turin, while he himself was on the road to La Torre. He appeared under the walls of that town at 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, the same 17th of April, attended by about 300 men. The main body of his army he had left encamped on the plain. That army, secretly prepared, was composed of Piedmont men, comprehending a good many banditti, who were promised pardon and plunder should they behave themselves well, some companies of Bavarians, 6 regiments of French, whose thirst for blood of the Huguenot wars had not been able to satiate, and several companies of Irish Romanists, who, banished by Cromwell, arrived in Piedmont dripping from the massacre of their Protestant fellow subjects in their native land. The Waldenses had hastily constructed a barricade at the entrance of La Torre. The Marquis ordered his soldiers to storm it, but the besieged resisted so stoutly that, after 3 hours' fighting, the enemy found he had made no advance. At 1 o'clock on that Sunday morning, Count Amadas of Lucerna, who knew the locality, made a flank movement along the banks of the Pillage, stole silently through the meadows and orchards, and advancing from the opposite quarter, attacked the Vaudois in the rear. They faced round, pierced the ranks of their assailants, and made good their retreat to the hills, leaving La Torre in the hands of the enemy. The Vaudois had lost only 3 men in all that fighting. It was now between 2 and 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, and though the hour was early, the Romanists repaired in a body to the church and chanted a Te Deum. The day was Palm Sunday, and in this fashion did the Roman Church, by her soldiers, celebrate that great festival of love and goodwill in the Waldensian valleys. The Vaudois were once more on their mountains. Their families had been previously transported to the natural fastness. Their sentinels kept watch night and day along the frontier heights. They could see the movements of Pianeza's army on the plains beneath. They beheld their orchards falling by the axes, and their dwellings being consumed by the torches of the soldiers. On Monday the 19th and Tuesday the 20th, a series of skirmishes took place along the line of their mountain passes and forts. The Vaudois, though poorly armed and vastly outnumbered, for they were but as 1 to 100, were victorious on all points. The Popish soldiers fell back in humiliating rout, carrying wondrous tales of the Vaudois valor and heroism to their comrades on the plain, and infusing incipient panic into the camp. Guilt is ever cowardly. Pianeza now began to have misgivings touching the issue. The recollection that mighty armies had aforetime perished on these mountains haunted and disquieted him. He betook him to a weapon which the Waldenses have ever been less able to cope with than the sword. On Wednesday the 21st, before daybreak, he announced, by sound of a trumpet, at the various Vaudois entrenchments, his willingness to receive their deputies and treat for peace. Delegates set out for his camp, and on their arrival at headquarters were received with the utmost urbanity, and sumptuously entertained. Pianeza expressed the utmost regret for the excesses his soldiers had committed, and which had been done, he said, contrary to orders. He protested that he had come into their valleys only to track a few fugitives who had disobeyed Gestaldal's order, that the higher communes had nothing to fear, that if they would admit a single regiment, each for a few days, in token of their loyalty, all would be amicably ended. The craft of the man conquered the deputies, and despite the warnings of the more sagacious, the pastor, Ledger in particular, the Waldenses opened the passes of their valleys and the doors of their dwellings to the soldiers of Pianeza. Alas, alas, these poor people were undone. They had received under their roof the murders of themselves and their families. The first 2 days, the 22nd and 23rd of April, were passed in comparative peace. The soldiers were eating at the same table, sleeping under the same roof, and conversing freely with their destined victims. This interval was needed to allow every preparation to be made for what was to follow. The enemy now occupied the towns, the villages, the cottages, and the roads throughout the valleys. They hung upon the heights. 2 great passes led into France, the one over the snows of the lofty Col Julien, and the other by the valley of Kyras into Dauphine. But alas, escape was not possible by either outlet. No one could traverse the Col Julien at this season and live, and the fortress of Maraboc, which guarded the narrow gorge which led into the valley of Kyras, the enemy had been careful to secure. The Vaudois were enclosed in a net, shut in as in a prison. At last the blow fell, with a sudden crash of the thunderbolt. At 4 o'clock on the morning of Saturday, the 24th of April, 1655, the signal was given from the castle hill of La Tour. But who shall rehearse the tragedy that followed? It is Cain a second time, says Monastier, shedding the blood of his brother Abel. On the instant, 1,000 assassins began the work of death. Dismay, horror, agony, woe, in a moment overspread the valleys of Lucerna and Angrogna. Though pandemonium had sent forth its fiends to riot in crime and revel in blood, they could not have outdone the soldiers of the propaganda. We see the victims climbing the hills with what speed they are able, the murderer on their track. We see the torrents as they roll down from the heights beginning to be tinged with blood. Gleams of lurid light burst out through the dark smoke that is rolling through the vales, for a priest and monk accompany each party of soldiers to set fire to the houses as soon as the inmates have been dispatched. Alas, what sounds are these that fall on our ears? The cries and groans of the dying are echoed and re-echoed from the rocks around, and it seems as if the mountains had taken up a wailing for the slaughter of their children. Our valley of Lucerna, exclaims Ledger, which was like a Goshen, was now converted into a Mount Etna, darting forth cinders and fire and flames. The earth resembled a furnace, and the air was filled with a darkness like that of Egypt, which might be felt from the smoke of towns, villages, temples, mansions, granges, and buildings, all burning in the flames of the Vatican. The soldiers were not content with the quick dispatch of the sword. They invented new and hitherto unheard-of modes of torture and death. No man at this day dare write in plain words all the disgusting and horrible deeds of these men. Their wickedness can never be at all known, because it never can be all told. From the awful narration of Ledger, we select only a few instances, but even these few, however mildly stated, grow, without our intending it, into a group of horrors. Little children were torn from the arms of their mothers, clasped by their tiny feet, and their heads dashed against the rocks, or were held between 2 soldiers, and their quivering limbs torn up by main force. Their mangled bodies were then thrown on the highways or fields to be devoured by beasts. The sick and aged were burned alive in their dwellings. Some had their hands and arms and legs lopped off, and fire applied to the severed parts to staunch the bleeding and prolong their suffering. Some were flayed alive, some were roasted alive, some disemboweled or tied to trees in their own orchards, and their hearts cut out. Some were horribly mutilated, and of others the brains were boiled and eaten by these cannibals. Some were fastened down into the furrows of their own fields and plowed into the soil as men plow manure into it. Others were buried alive. Fathers were marched to death with the heads of their sons suspended around their necks. Parents were compelled to look on while their children were first outraged, then massacred, before being themselves permitted to die. But here we must stop. We cannot proceed farther in Ledger's awful narration. There come vile, abominable, and monstrous deeds, utterly and overwhelmingly disgusting, horrible and fiendish, which we dare not transcribe. The heart sickens, and the brain begins to swim. My hand trembles, says Ledger, so that I scarce can hold the pen, and my tears mingle in torrents with my ink, while I write the deeds of these children of darkness, blacker even than the Prince of Darkness himself. No general account, however awful, can convey so correct an idea of the horrors of this persecution as would the history of individual cases, but this we are precluded from giving. Could we take these martyrs one by one, we would describe the tragic fate of Peter Simeon of Angrogna, the barbarous death of Magdalene, wife of Peter Pallon of Valaro, the sad story, but no, that story could not be told, of Anne, the daughter of John Charbonnier of La Tour, the cruel martyrdom of Paul Garnier of Rora, whose eyes were first plucked out, who next endured other horrible indignities, and last of all was flayed alive, and his skin, divided into 4 parts, extended on the window gratings of the 4 principal houses in Lucerna. Could we describe these cases, with hundreds of others equally horrible and appalling, our narrative would grow so harrowing that our readers, unable to proceed, would turn from the page. Literally did the Waldenses suffer all the things of which the Apostle speaks, as endured by the martyrs of old, with other torments then not invented, or which the rage of even a Nero shrank from inflicting. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, and in mountains, and in dens, and caves of the earth. These cruelties form a scene that is unparalleled and unique in the history of at least civilized countries. There have been tragedies in which more blood was spilt and more life sacrificed, but none in which the actors were so completely dehumanized and the forms of suffering so monstrously disgusting, so unutterably cruel and revolting. The Piedmont massacres in this respect stand alone. They are more fiendish than all the atrocities and murders before or since, and Ledger may still advance his challenge to all travelers and all who have studied the history of ancient and modern pagans, whether among the Chinese, Tartars, and Turks, they ever witnessed or heard tell of such execrable perfidies and barbarities. The authors of these deeds, thinking it may be that their very atrocity would make the world slow to believe them, made bold to deny that they had ever been done, even before the blood was well dry in the valleys. Pastor Ledger took instant and effectual means to demonstrate the falsehood of that denial, and to provide that clear, irrefragable, and indubitable proof of these awful crimes should go down to posterity. He traveled from commune to commune immediately after the massacre, attended by notaries who took down the depositions and attestations of the survivors and eyewitnesses of these deeds in presence of the council and consistory of the place. From the evidence of these witnesses he compiled and gave to the world a book, which Dr. Gilly truly characterized as one of the most dreadful in existence. The originals of these depositions Ledger gave to Sir Samuel Morland, who deposited them, together with other valuable documents pertaining to the Waldenses, in the library of the University of Cambridge. Uncontrollable grief seized the hearts of the survivors at the sight of their brethren slain, their country devastated, and their church overthrown. "Oh, that my head were waters," exclaims Ledger, "and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. Behold, I see, if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow, it was then," he adds, "that the fugitives, who had been snatched as brands from the burning, could address God in the words of the 79th Psalm, which literally, as emphatically, describes their condition. O God, the heathen are come into thine inheritance. Thy holy temple they have defiled. They have laid Jerusalem on heaps. The dead bodies of thy servants have they given, to be meat unto the fowls of heaven, the flesh of thy saints unto the beasts of the earth. Their blood have they shed like water, and there was none to bury them." When the storm had abated, Ledger assembled the scattered survivors in order to take counsel with them as to the steps to be now taken. It does not surprise us to find that some had begun to entertain the idea of abandoning the valleys altogether. Ledger strongly dissuaded them against the thought of forsaking their ancient inheritance. They must, he said, rebuild their Zion in the faith that the God of their fathers would not permit the church of the valleys to be finally overthrown. To encourage them, he undertook to lay a representation of their sufferings and broken condition before their brethren of other countries, who, he was sure, would hasten to their help at this great crisis. These counsels prevailed. "Our tears are no longer of water," so wrote the remnant of the slaughtered Vaudois to the Protestants of Europe. "They are of blood. They do not merely obscure our sight, they choke our very hearts. Our hands tremble, and our heads ache by the many blows we have received. We cannot frame an epistle answerable to the intent of our minds, and the strangeness of our desolation. We pray you to excuse us, and to collect amid our groans the meaning of what we fain would utter." After this touching introduction, they proceed with a representation of their state, expressing themselves in terms, the moderation of which contrasts strongly with the extent of the wrongs done. Protestant Europe was horror-struck when the tale of the massacre was laid before it. Nowhere did these awful tidings awaken a deeper sympathy or kindle a stronger indignation than in England. Cromwell, who was then at the head of the state, proclaimed a fast, ordered a collection for the sufferers, and wrote to all the Protestant princes and to the King of France, with the intent of enlisting their sympathy and aid in behalf of the Vaudois, one of the noblest as well as most sacred of the tasks ever undertaken by the great poet, who then acted as the Protector's Latin secretary, was the writing of these letters. Milton's pen was not less gloriously occupied when writing in behalf of these venerable sufferers for conscience sake, than when writing Paradise Lost. In token of the deep interest he took in the affair, Cromwell sent Sir Samuel Morland with a letter to the Duke of Savoy, expressive of the astonishment and sorrow he felt at the barbarities which had been committed on those who were his brethren in the faith. Cromwell's ambassador visited the valleys on his way to Turin, and saw with his own eyes the frightful spectacle which the region still presented. "If," said he, addressing the Duke, the horrors he had just seen giving point to his eloquence, and kindling his republican plainness into Puritan fervor, "if the tyrants of all times and ages were alive again, they would doubtless be ashamed to find that nothing barbarous nor inhuman in comparison with these deeds had ever been invented by them. In the meantime," he continued, "the angels are stricken with horror. Men are dizzy with amazement. Heaven itself appears astonished with the cries of the dying, and the very earth to blush with the gore of so many innocent persons. Avenge not thyself, O God, for this mighty wickedness, this parricidal slaughter. Let thy blood, O Christ, wash out this blood. We have repeatedly mentioned the Castelluzza in our narrative of this people and their many martyrdoms. It is closely connected with the massacre of 1655, and as such kindled the muse of Milton. It stands at the entrance of the valley, its feet swathed in feathery woods, above which a mass of debris and fallen rock, which countless tempests have gathered like a girdle around its middle. From amidst these the supreme column shoots up, pillar-like, and touches that white cloud which is floating past in mid-heaven. One can see a dark spot on the face of the cliff just below the crowning rocks of the summit. It would be taken for the shadow of a passing cloud on the mountains, were it not that it is immovable. That is the mouth of the cave, so roomy, it is said, as to be able to contain some hundreds. To this friendly chamber the Waldenses were wont to flee when the valley beneath was a perfect pandemonium, glittering with steel, red, and crime, and ringing with execrations and blasphemies. To this cave many of the Vaudois fled on occasion of the great massacre. But alas, there the persecutor tracked them, and dragging them forth, rolled them down the awful precipice. The law that indissolubly links great crimes with the spot where they were perpetrated has written the massacre of 1655 on this mountain, and given it an eternal keeping to its rock. There is not another such martyr's monument in the whole world. While the Castelluzzo stands, the memory of this great crime cannot die. Through all the ages it will continue to cry, and that cry our most sublime poet has interpreted in his most stirring sonnet. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold, even them who kept thy truth so pure of old. When all our fathers worship stocks and stones, forget not, in thy book, record their groans, who were thy sheep, and in their ancient fold, slain by the bloody Piedmontese that rolled, mother with infant, down the rocks. Their moans the vales redoubled to the hills, and they to heaven. Their martyred blood and ashes sow o'er all the Italian fields where still does sway the triple tyrant that from these may grow 100-fold, who having learned thy way, early may fly the Babylonian woe. Chapter 12. Exploits of Gianavello. Massacre and Pillage of Rora. Ascent of Lacombe. Beauty and grandeur of Valley of Rora. Gianavello. His character. Marquis di Pianeza. His first assault. Brave repulse. Treachery of the Marquis. No faith with heretics. Gianavello's band. Repulse of second and third attacks. Death of a persecutor. An army raised to invade Rora. Massacre and pillage. Letter of Pianeza. Gianavello's heroic reply. Gianavello renews the war. 500 against 15,000. Success of the Waldenses. Horror at the massacre. Interposition of England. Letter of Cromwell. Treaty of Peace. The next tragic episode in the history of the Waldenses takes us to the Valley of Rora. The invasion and outrages of which this valley became the scene were contemporaneous with the horrors of the Great Massacre. That which we are now able to relate, feats of heroism are blended with deeds of suffering. and we are called to admire the valor of the patriot as well as the patience of the martyr. The valley of Rora lies on the left as one enters the Latour. It is separated from Lucerna by a barrier of mountains. Rora has two entrances, one by a side ravine, which branches off about 2 miles before reaching Latour, and the other by crossing the valley of Lucerna and climbing the mountains. This last is worthy of being briefly described. We start, we shall suppose, from the town of Latour. We skirt the Castelluso on the right, which high above us hangs its precipice, with their many tragic memories. From this point we turn to the left, descend into the valley, and traverse its bright meadows, here shaded by the vine, which stretches its arms in classic freedom from tree to tree. We cross the torrent of the Pillage by a small bridge. We hold on our way till we reach the foot of the mountains of Lacombe, that wall in the valley of Rora. We begin to climb by a winding path. Pasture and vineyard give place to chestnut forests. The chestnut in turn yields to the pine. And as we mount still higher, we find ourselves amid the naked ledges of the mountain, with their gushing rills, margined by moss and other alpine herbage. An ascent of 2 hours brings us to the summit of the pass. We have here a pedestal, some 4,000 feet in height, in the midst of a stupendous amphitheater of Alps, from which to view their glories. How profoundly deep the valley from which we have just climbed up! A thread of silver is now the Pillage. A patch of green, a few inches square, is now the meadow. The chestnut tree is a mere dot, hardly visible, and yonder are Latour and the white Volaro, so tiny that they look as if they could be packed into a child's toy box. But while all else has diminished, the mountains seem to have enlarged their bulk and increased their stature. High above us towers the summit of the Castelluso. Still higher rise the rolling masses of the Vandelin, the lower slopes of which form a vast and magnificent hanging garden, utterly dwarfing those of which we read as one of the wonders of Babylon. And in the far distance the eye rests on the tumultuous sea of mountains, here rising in needles, there running off in long serrated ridges, and there standing up in massy peaks of naked granite, wearing the shiny garments which winter weaves for the giants of the Alps. We now descend into the valley of Rora. It lies at our feet, a cup of verdure, some 60 miles in circumference, its sides and bottom variously clothed with cornfields and meadow, with vineyard and orchard, with the walnut, the cherry, and all fruit-bearing trees, from amid which numerous brown chalets peep out. The great mountains sweep round the valley like a wall, and among them, preeminent in glory, as in stature, stands the monarch of the Cottian Alps, Monte Viso. As among the Jews of old, so among the Waldenses, God raised up from time to time mighty men of valor to deliver his people. One of the most remarkable of these men was Gianavello, commonly known as Captain Joshua Gianavello, a native of this same valley of Rora. He appears, from the accounts that have come down to us, to have possessed all the qualities of a great military leader. He was a man of daring courage, of resolute purpose, and of venturous enterprise. He had the faculty, so essential in a commander, of skillful combination. He was fertile in resource, and self-possessed in emergencies. He was quick to resolve and prompt to execute. His devotion and energy were the means, under God, of mitigating somewhat the horrors of the massacre of 1655, and his heroism ultimately rolled back the tide of that great calamity and made it recoil upon its authors. It was the morning of the 24th of April, 1665, the day which saw the butchery commenced that we have already described. On that same day, 500 soldiers were dispatched by the Marquis de Pianeza to the valley of Rora, to massacre its unoffending and unsuspecting inhabitants. Ascending from the valley of Pillage, they had gained the summit of the pass, and were already descending on the town of Rora, stealthily and swiftly, as a herd of wolves that might descend upon a sheepfold, or, as says Ledger, a brood of vultures might descend upon a flock of harmless doves. Happily, Gianavello, who had known for weeks before that a storm was gathering, though he knew not when or where it would burst, was on the outlook. He saw the troop and guessed their errand. There was not a moment to be lost, a little longer, and not a man would be left alive in Rora to carry tidings of its fate to the next commune. But was Gianavello single-handed to attack an army of 500 men? He stole uphill, under cover of the rocks and trees, and on his way he prevailed on 6 peasants, brave men like himself, to join him in repelling the invaders. The heroic little band marched on till they were near the troop. Then, hiding amid the bushes, they lay in ambush by the side of the path. The soldiers came on, little suspecting the trap into which they were marching. Gianavello and his men fired, and with so unerring an aim that 7 of the troop fell dead. Then, reloading their pieces and dexterously changing their ground, they fired again with a like effect. The attack was unexpected. The foe was invisible. The frightened imaginations of Pianeza's soldiers multiplied tenfold the number of their assailants. They began to retreat, but Gianavello and his men, bounding from cover to cover like so many chamois, hung upon their rear, and did deadly execution with their bullets. The invaders left 54 of their number dead behind them, and thus did these 7 peasants chase from their valley of Rora the 500 assassins who had come to murder its peaceful inhabitants. That same afternoon the people of Rora, who were ignorant of the fearful murders which were at that very moment proceeding in the valley of their brethren, repaired to the Marquis de Pianeza to complain of the attack. The Marquis affected ignorance of the whole affair. "Those who invaded your valley," said he, "were a set of banditti. You did right to repel them. Go back to your families and fear nothing. I pledge my word and honor that no evil shall happen to you." These deceitful words did not impose upon Gianavello. He had a wholesome recollection of the maxim enacted by the Council of Constance, and so often put in practice in the valleys: no faith is to be kept with heretics. Pianeza, he knew, was the agent of the Council of Extirpation. Hardly had the next morning broke when the hero peasant was abroad, scanning with eagle eye the mountain paths that led into his valley. It was not long till his suspicions were more than justified. 600 men at arms, chosen with special reference to this difficult enterprise, were seen ascending the mountain Castelletto, and do what their comrades of the previous day had failed to accomplish. Gianavello had now mustered a little host of 18, of whom 12 were armed with muskets and swords, and 6 with only the sling. These he divided into 3 parties, each consisting of 4 musketeers and 2 slingers, and he posted them in a defile, through which he saw the invaders must pass. No sooner had the van of the enemy entered the gorge than a shower of bullets and stones from invisible hands saluted them. Every bullet and stone did its work. The first discharge brought down an officer and 12 men. That volley was succeeded by others equally fatal. The cry was raised, "All is lost, save yourselves!" The flight was precipitate, and every bush and rock seemed to vomit forth deadly missiles. Thus a second ignominious retreat ridded the valley of Rora of these murderers. The inhabitants carried their complaints a second time to Pianeza, concealing, as Ledger says, the ferocity of the tiger under the skin of a fox. He assured the deputies that the attack had been the result of a misunderstanding, that certain accusations had been lodged against them, the falsity of which had since been discovered, and now they might return to their homes, for they had nothing to fear. No sooner were they gone than Pianeza began vigorously to prepare for a third attack. He organized a battalion of from 800 to 900 men. Next morning this host made a rapid march on Rora, seized all the avenues leading into the valley, and chasing the inhabitants to the caves of Monte Friolante, he set fire to their dwellings, having first plundered them. Captain Joshua Gianavello, at the head of his little troop, saw the enemy enter, but their numbers were so overwhelming that he waited a more favorable moment for attacking them. The soldiers were retiring, laden with their booty, and driving before them the cattle of the peasants. Gianavello knelt down before his hero band, and giving thanks to God, who had twice by his hand saved his people, he prayed that the hearts and arms of his followers might be strengthened to work yet another deliverance. He then attacked the foe. The spoilers turned and fled uphill, in the hope of escaping into the valley of the Pillage, throwing away their booty in their flight. When they had gained the pass and begun their descent, their flight became yet more disastrous. Great stones, torn up and rolled after them, were mingled with the bullets and did deadly execution upon them, while the precipices over which they fell, in their haste, consummated their destruction. The few who survived fled to Vellaro. The Marquis de Pianeza, instead of seeing in these events the finger of God, was only the more inflamed with rage, and the more resolutely bent on the extirpation of every heretic from the valley of Rora. He assembled all the royal troops then under his command, or which could be spared from the massacre in which they were occupied in the other valleys, in order to surround the little territory. This was now the fourth attack on the commune of Rora, but the invaders were destined once more to recoil before the shock of its heroic defenders. Some 8,000 men had been got under arms, and were ready to march against Rora. But the impatience of a certain Captain Mario, who had signalized himself in the massacre of Bobbio, and wished to appropriate the entire glory of the enterprise, would not permit him to await the movement of the main body. He marched 2 hours in advance, with 3 companies of regular troops, few of whom ever returned. Their ferocious leader, borne along by the rush of his panic-stricken soldiers, was precipitated over the edge of the rock into the stream, and badly bruised. He was drawn out and carried to Lucerna, where he died 2 days afterward, in great torment of body, and yet greater torment of mind. Of the 3 companies which he led in this fatal expedition, one was composed of Irish, who had been banished by Cromwell, and who met in this distant land the death they had inflicted on others in their own, leaving their corpses to fatten those valleys which were to have been theirs, had they succeeded in purging them of heresy and heretics. This series of strange events was now drawing to an end. The fury of Pianeza knew no bounds. This war of his, though waged only with herdsmen, had brought him nothing but disgrace, and the loss of his bravest soldiers. Victor Amadeus once observed that the skin of Ari Vaudois cost him 15 of his best Piedmont soldiers. Pianeza had lost some hundreds of his best soldiers, and yet not one of the little troop of Gianavello, dead or alive, had he been able to set into his hands. Nevertheless, he resolved to continue with the first troop of 3,000 on the summit of the pass that gives entrance from the valley of the Pillage. A second of 6,000 had entered by the ravine at the foot of the valley, and a third of 1,000 had crossed the mountains that divide Bagnolo from Bora. But alas, who shall describe the horrors that followed the entrance of these assassins? Blood, burning, and rapine in an instant overwhelmed the little community. No distinction was made of age or sex. None had pity for their tender years. None had reverence for their gray hairs. Happy they who were slain at once, and thus escaped horrible indignities and tortures. The few spared from the sword were carried away as captives, and among these were the wife and the 3 daughters of Gianavello. There was now nothing more in the valley of Rora for which the patriot hero could do battle. The light of his hearth was quenched. His village was a heap of smoking ruins. His fathers and brethren had fallen by the sword. But rising, superior to these accumulated calamities, he marched his little troop over the mountains to wait on the frontier of his country whatever opportunities Providence might yet open to him of wielding his sword in defense of the ancient liberties and the glorious faith of his people. It was at this time that Pianeza, intending to deal the finishing blow that would crush the hero of Rora, wrote to Gianavello as follows: I exhort you for the last time to renounce your heresy. This is the only hope of your obtaining the pardon of your prince, and of saving the life of your wife and daughters, now my prisoners, and whom, if you continue obstinate, I will burn alive. As for yourself, my soldiers shall no longer pursue you, but I will set such a price upon your head as that you were Beelzebub himself. You shall infallibly be taken. And be assured that if you fall alive into my hands, there are no torments with which I will not punish your rebellion. To these ferocious threats, Gianavello thoughtfully and promptly replied, There are no torments so terrible, no death so barbarous, that I would not choose rather than deny my Savior. Your threats cannot cause me to renounce my faith, but they fortify me in it. Should the Marquis de Pianeza cause my wife and daughters to pass through the fire, it can but consume their mortal bodies. Should it please him that I fall into the Marquis's hands. We do not know whether Pianeza was capable of seeing that this was the most mortifying defeat he had yet sustained at the hands of the peasant hero of Rora, and that he might as well war against the Alps themselves as against a cause that could infuse a spirit like this into its champions. Gianavello's reply, observes Ledger, certified him as a chosen instrument in the hands of God for the recovery of his country, seemingly lost. Gianavello had saved from the wreck of his family his infant son, and his first care was to seek a place of safety for him. Laying him on his shoulders, he passed the frozen Alps which separate the valley of Lucerne from France. He entrusted the child to the care of a relative at Kyrus, in the valleys of the French Protestants. With the child he carried thither the tidings of the awful massacre of his people. Indignation was roused. Not a few were willing to join his standard. Brave spirits like himself, and, with his little band greatly recruited, he repassed the Alps in a few weeks, to begin his second and more successful campaign. On his arrival in the valleys, he was joined by Giahéry, under whom a troop had been assembling to avenge the massacre of their brethren. In Giahéry, Captain Gianavello had found a companion worthy of himself, and worthy of the cause for which he was now in arms. Of this heroic man, Ledger has recorded that, though he possessed the courage of a lion, he was as humble as a lamb, always giving to God the glory of his victories, well versed in Scripture, and understanding controversy, and of great natural talent. The massacre had reduced the Vaudois race to all but utter extermination, and 500 men were all that the two leaders could collect round their standard. The army opposed to them, and at this time in their valleys, was from 15 to 20,000 strong, consisting of trained and picked soldiers. Nothing but an impulse from the god of battles could have moved these two men, with such a handful, to take the field against such odds. To the eye of a common hero all would have seemed lost. But the courage of these two Christian warriors was based on faith. They believed that God would not permit his cause to perish, or the lamp of the valleys to be extinguished, and, few though they were, they knew that God was able, by their humble instrumentality, to save their country and church. In this faith they unsheathed the sword, and so valiantly did they wield it, that soon that sword became the terror of the Piedmont armies. The ancient promise was fulfilled. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Be informed. edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview. Because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOPI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.